One of the curious things about living in the town where you grew up are the flashbacks, past incidences recurring vividly in the mind. One of my best friends growing up was, who remains a close friend today, Bill Eddy, was raised in the house across from where Joanne and I live now, except our house didn't exist when we were kids. It was Sam Anderson's cow pasture then. When Bill and I were in the 5th grade, I told a girl in our class that Bill loved her, which was true, but not for publication. He invited me over to his house after school. He said, "Come on over, let's play." I said, "Okay." And we went for a hike through Sam Anderson's cow pasture, where our home now sits. And just about where our front door is now, Bill turned around and punched me smack in the nose, knocking me to the ground, then said, "That's for blabbing your mouth off." To this day, whenever I walk out our front door, my nose twitches, still reminding me after all these years to mind my own business. George Evanoff was our 5th grade teacher and taught us arcane tidbits of American history, one of which was the fascinating history of the Michigan-Ohio War of 1835 and 36. Are any of you familiar with this war? It was a war when both Michigan and Ohio claimed a 486 square mile region along their common border in northern Ohio. Unable to resolve their differences, the governors sent their state militias to battle, who apparently weren't as worked up about it as the governor, because all they did was gather on each side of the Maumee River near present-day Toledo, where they traded insults and then got drunk together. Congress intervened, granting the disputed territory to Ohio, in recompense carving off the Upper Peninsula from Wisconsin and giving it to Michigan, who at first refused to accept it, thinking the land was worthless, but eventually, albeit grudgingly, accepted the deal, shortly afterwards discovering rich deposits of iron ore, lead, and copper, fueling the American Industrial Revolution, in the process making Michigan one of our most affluent states. Don't let anyone ever tell you that borders don't matter. We've been talking about maps and how the earliest maps in our lives, be they people or paper, have such a profound effect on our lives. We've since been thinking about those characteristics of maps that mirror our own lives. So today I want to talk about the features of maps we would do well to include in our lives, and that is boundaries. Clear lines of demarcation that mark our business and the business of others, so the two are never confused, lest we end up getting punched in the nose. On maps, boundaries are lines separating cities, towns, states, nations. But when we speak of boundaries in our relationships, we mean the personal limits and rules that we establish within our relationships with others. An example of a personal boundary would be a parent's decision to remain disconnected from their adult children's finances. I have a friend who gifted her child with a house down payment, but refused to sign on her mortgage, to co-sign on the mortgage. And that's a boundary. That's generally a good boundary. Not one that I paid any attention to, but it's a good boundary. Another friend of mine not only refused to help with his son's house down payment, he also wouldn't co-sign on the mortgage, telling his son, "There's always a sign when you're ready to buy a house, you get this sign. And his son said, what's the sign? He said, the sign is this. It is time to buy a house when you can buy it without your parents' co-signature. That's also a boundary. My 8-year-old granddaughter doesn't like being hugged without first being asked. My body, my rules, she says. That's a boundary her grandmother Joanne taught her, and it's a good boundary. A person with healthy boundaries can say no to others when they want to, but they're also comfortable opening themselves up to closer relationships when they're ready. To be clear, boundaries aren't the same as solid walls. Walls keep everyone out, which isn't desirable. Boundaries are different. Boundaries teach us where the doors are. Where the doors are. Do you remember in the Bible when it would say Jesus went away by himself to a quiet place? Boundaries allow us to disengage so that when it is necessary or desirable, we can engage. We can open the door. Beware of people who always ask you to violate the personal limits you've set for yourself. I know a person whose life was an economic train wreck and often asked me for money. And I would always give it to them because I thought that if someone asked me for money and I had it, it was my duty to give them to them. So I would always give this person money until I realized that my generosity was enabling his irresponsibility. So I started telling him no. Now, the first time I told him no, he said, "Thank you for holding me accountable. You have inspired me to conduct myself more appropriately." No, I'm just kidding. He didn't say that. He was, as it says in the Old Testament, pisseth off and said, "I thought you were a Christian." And I said, "I am a Christian. And as a Christian, I am committed to your growth, which will only happen when you accept responsibility for your life." It was one of the few occasions of my life when I had the answer right there and didn't have to think of it a day later. When we don't have boundaries, we allow other people, often less healthy people, to rule and sometimes even ruin our lives. Boundaries are not mean, nor are they selfish or snobbish. They are the fences that make good neighbors. Remember this: if someone throws a fit because you set boundaries, it is more evidence the boundary was needed. If someone throws a fit because you set boundaries, it is more evidence the boundary was needed. Just as it is important to have financial and emotional boundaries, it is also imperative to have religious and spiritual boundaries. Religion, and it's the odd thing about religion, but religion makes some people think they have the right, and just not the right, but the sacred duty to tell the rest of us what we must believe, think, and feel. And if you think about it, religions are mostly codified boundaries imposed by leaders on followers. Believe this, not that. Do this, not that. Say this, not that. But healthy spirituality begins when we find within ourselves the strength, courage, and independence to follow our light, not someone else's. It is never selfish to say, "My conscience will not permit me to do what you are asking." My discernment will not permit me to believe what you believe. My self-respect will not permit me to be led by someone who has no respect for me. Establishing and maintaining our boundaries is an ongoing work. One of my favorite poems by Robert Frost, the poem Mending Wall. Robert Frost wrote about the damage done to stone walls by frost heave and by hunters. And he described meeting with his neighbor each spring to walk the wall and repair the gaps. He writes of gaps. No one has seen them made or heard them made, but at spring mending time, we find them there. I let my neighbor know beyond the hill, and on a day we meet to walk the line and set the walls between us once again. Boundaries are a gift to ourselves and others. They make possible civility, responsibility, autonomy, and relationship. This past Thursday, I asked our experts on artificial intelligence, John Essex and Treg Hopkins, to use AI to discern what Jesus might have said about personal boundaries if he'd only gotten around to it. 5 minutes later, Treg sent back an entire sermon along with a centering thought and a pastoral prayer. It made me realize in that moment that my years of work and study have been absolutely inconsequential. John sent this snippet of Jesus talking about the wisdom of boundaries. Be wise in your associations. Do not cast your pearls before swine, for they will trample them under their feet. Recognize the value of the treasure within you and share it with those who honor and respect it. So friends, know well the lines where your life ends and someone else's life begins. Mind that line and tend it daily, knowing good boundaries do not constrain us, but set us free. Well, whenever I go to Paoli, I drive past the meeting house where Joanne and I were married 39 years ago. And Joanne is always looking away, stricken with sorrow, and I am always happy. I'm always happy to drive by there.
Are we in the same car?
But I remember that day when we got married, because I was raised this way, I think is why I thought it, that I thought, how wonderful. My life and authority now extends to two people. And the pastor who married us was very old-fashioned and made Joanne promise certain things during our wedding, one of which was obedience. Obedience, and apparently she had her fingers crossed. So I entered into the most significant relationship in my life with this mindset, which Joanne disabused me of within a day of our vows, saying, when I asked her to explain herself after she had said no to me about something, she said, Philip, no is a complete answer and needs no explanation. It was one of the most important things I've ever learned. I wish I could say that I have never asked anything of her since, and never given her any cause to remind me again that no is a complete answer. But this is a lesson I have to learn and relearn time and again. So friends, just remember, no is a complete sentence. No is a complete sentence. And if someone gets mad at you because you have said no, it is a good indication that no was just the right answer. So learn to say yes with joy, and learn also to say no. Turn and greet friends.